Hi, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ileana Selejan to deliver our fifth lecture in the series concerning photography and democracy. Dr. Selejan is a lecturer in art history, culture and society at Edinburgh College of Art at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. She is a member of the Photo Demos Research Collective and has held curatorial research and teaching positions at the Department of Anthropology at University College London, at the Decolonising Arts Institute at the University of the Arts in London, at Central St Martin's, also in London, at the Davis Museum, Wesley College, and New York University, the Tisch School of the Arts, and the Parsons School of Design. Her co-edited volume with Photo Demos, Citizens of Photography, the Camera and the Political Imagination, was published by the prestigious Duke University Press. It's a great pleasure to have Ileana here to speak with us today. So I'll turn my camera off and hand over to you, Ileana, and we look forward to hearing your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Tom, and to Colleen and Alan as well for the lovely invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone in attendance. Okay, I'm just going to jump right in. Just give me one moment to get my presentation started. Okay. So, on the 9th of May 2018, hundreds of people, thousands most likely, gathered along Managua's principal traffic artery as part of a march, heading towards the city's main commercial center and transportation hub. Looking at photographs of this event now, almost 7 years later, gives me pause. I'm finding it hard to distinguish much or any individual characteristics under the surface of this colorful multitude. I see faces, raised fists and arms, phones and cameras in hand, items of clothing, some umbrellas, and countless flags in blue and white. The national colors later became synonymous with a pluralistic opposition movement that was taking shape right there, right then, on the city's streets. I can still hear the wall of sound engulfing the scene, voices chanting, speaking, all at once, music blasting from loudspeakers, vuvuzelas, car horns, all in all, a maddening, intrinsic sight and sound dissolving in the hot midday sun. Despite the anger and pain, people seemed determined. In that very moment, the march was cheerful, even, as if this were some kind of a celebratory event. This isn't a coincidence, as in Nicaragua, like elsewhere in Latin America, carnivalesque street fairs and fiestas have always entailed subversive elements. I observed the crowd molding itself against the contours of the city, squeezing in tight. In its stride, all available surfaces, walls, even the tarmac, became expressive devices. Like empty canvases, they turned into discursive territories to be conquered, accumulating layer upon layer of posters, graffiti, and tags. And I'm going to return to these images later on in the talk. The 2018 civic uprising in Nicaragua represented the largest and most significant protest movement since the Sandinista revolution came to an end in 1990. I'm showing you here an Instagram story drawing direct comparison between the two, and a quick reminder that the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or the FSLN, assumed power following the 1978-79 popular insurrection and the ousting of dictator Anastasio Somoza Debayle. From April to July 2018, massive protests swept through Nicaragua's capital city, Managua, spreading to other major cities and towns. At first, gatherings and sit-ins were organized primarily by students, outraged by the government's mishandling of a devastating fire that engulfed the Indio Maíz, one of the country's largest natural reserves. The public's indignation only increased when controversial social security legislation was passed soon thereafter. Protests quickly amplified, not least due to the violent repression by the police and paramilitary forces under the watchful gaze of a supposedly revolutionary regime led by President Daniel Ortega and his vice president, now co-president, wife, Rosario Murillo. Ortega had been a member seen here swearing in next to Fidel Castro. Ortega had been a member of the Junta de Gobierno de Reconstrucción, the Junta of National Reconstruction, which governed Nicaragua in the aftermath of 1979, becoming president of the republic from 1984 to 1990. The FSLN returned to power under his leadership only in 2006, and Rosario Murillo was sworn in as vice president as recently as 2017. This is what the couple's official portraits looked like in Managua after April 2018. Alongside, I'm showing you the cover of Libération, the French newspaper, from July 20th, 2018, one day after the anniversary of the revolutionary victory of 1979. Ortega basta, it reads. April and May saw civil disobedience actions mounting, the occupation of universities accompanied by massive marches involving all the main sectors of the population, with Managua as a focal point. The city's main avenues, its most trafficked roundabouts and squares, became the background against which multitudes would gather repeatedly. The accent was on peaceful resistance, in direct opposition to the armed militancy that was typically associated with political unrest throughout the country's past. This turn was immediately reflected in the discourse that was generated on the street, where protesters flipped the revolutionary slogan "Patria libre o morir," free country, or free motherland or death, to "Patria libre y vivir," free country or motherland and live. Alongside the multitude of people, an even greater multitude of images emerged. Cameras, mobile phones, and other types of recording devices accompanied the protests continuously, leaving behind an indelible photographic archive. A type of leveling could be observed whereby all images, still and moving, whether made by photojournalists, professional photographers, or everyday observers, became equally noteworthy and unimportant at the same time. Their significance relied upon their plurality, their functions contingent upon their being part of a whole. The undeclared state of emergency allowed a precarious visual economy to emerge, supplanting all the others. Premised upon speed and precision, this cacophonous, repetitive, redundant photographic object required a multiplicity of viewing points, the phone cameras concomitantly raised, in order to endure. Tellingly, it was these poor images, to borrow Hito Styles' term, uploaded and exchanged raw, that constituted the bulk of the evidence that was later used by international human rights organizations in condemning the actions of the ruling regime. I'm showing here a screenshot of an interactive feature that was created by the interdisciplinary group of independent experts as part of their in-depth investigation into the events of 2018. Operating under the mandate of the Organization of American States, the group established that, and I quote, "the state of Nicaragua perpetrated actions that amount to crimes against humanity according to international law, namely murders, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, and persecution." This was December 2018. So, throughout 2018, this flood of images remained constant. Oh, and by the way, I have a link here, and I really suggest taking a look at this website. It's quite incredible, and you can follow different events on different days and different periods of the protests, and to see also what happened. And everything is really documented through by everyday citizens rather than professional photojournalists or anything like that. Okay, so throughout 2018, this flood of images remained constant, reverberating through online spaces and into people's homes. It opened up spaces for resistance and for the imagination, especially once outwardly directed actions were curtailed. The instinctive reaction to raise one's camera, one's phone, as a gesture aimed towards openness and participation was later turned onto its head, exposing individuals to governmental surveillance, policing, and prosecution. So a kind of very interesting example of where the camera is first with the people and then it turns against the people. In the years since, due to ongoing pressure, censorship, and the criminalization of dissent, citizens were forced to take down their posts. Yet such ephemera continue to accumulate into ever-expanding collections of files and screenshots, a large pixelated mass. An interesting example is the account Paredes Nicas, Nica Walls, which crowdsourced images of interventions in public space throughout Nicaragua. So social media have given rise to impromptu archives that have sought to preserve this content as a means of documentation, but also as a repository for memory. The civic uprising ended in July 2018, crushed by a ferocious terror campaign called Operación Limpieza, an Operation Cleanup, organized by the police and paramilitary forces, and which has been condemned by numerous international human rights organizations. There's lots of kind of injury that happened during that period, but we know that at least 355 individuals were killed during these initial stages of the repression, according to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Since then, the Nicaraguan government has continued to repress the population, having passed legislation to criminalize all forms of dissent. Protests and marches are illegal, arbitrary detentions customary, opposition on independent media non-existent, free speech curtailed. In June 2021, Tamara Davila, seen here, was arrested and imprisoned without a fair trial. She's a sociologist and also a feminist activist. Anyhow, she was subsequently kept in inhumane conditions without a right to see a lawyer, her family, even her young daughter, and was only released a part of an agreement with the United States on February 9, 2023. She remains in exile. This was just one example of the degree, the extent to which persecution continues in the country. Images such as the ones I've been showing will inevitably appear familiar to many contemporary viewers. Not necessarily in the context of Nicaragua, however. Summoned from memory, all these images of, you name it, protest, unrest, they hinge upon a trope that has become perhaps characteristic of our time. They're just, these are just some of the many dissenting voices that are assembling, another resistance movement rising amongst the increasing discontent that has shaped recent experience. Of course, context is essential, and it is worth noting that the Nicaraguan protests took place during a period of major civic unrest throughout the region. You might recall that in May 2018, Nicolás Maduro was proclaimed president of Venezuela for a controversial second term. The country had experienced major turmoil and frequent protests since 2014, repression ever increasing. And I'm just showing here kind of some episodic snippets of that from 2014, a headline in Mother Jones of Venezuela turned into a war zone. Then 2017, a massive protest, the mother of all marches, against Maduro. And then in January 2019, after Maduro's inauguration, and again, I'm kind of trying to focus here on these images of masses of crowds. Okay, so yes, a wave of massive anti-governmental protests swept across Latin America in October 2019, from Ecuador to Bolivia, Honduras, and Chile. In Ecuador, the detonante, the trigger, was the imposition of an austerity package, which included a raise in the cost of fuel as part of a government deal with the International Monetary Fund. Whereas in Bolivia, it was perceived irregularities during the electoral process and then the announcement of the re-election of Evo Morales for a fourth presidential term. In Uruguay, on the 22nd of October, 55,000 people joined the march to protest the so-called Reforma Vivir Sin Miedo, Live Without Fear reform, in the center of Montevideo. The reform was to increase the military's role in the country's internal affairs, an ominous prospect given the history of the military dictatorship that lasted from 1973 to 1985. Like many of my friends and interlocutors, I too watched the Chilean protests of 2019 with awe. Bird's eye view footage showing thousands of people flooding the streets, converging upon Plaza Italia in Santiago, like arteries and veins pulsating with life. An estimated 1.2 million gathered in the city that day, and 3 million across the country. And if you've seen videos of this, or if you haven't, please look them up, because the kind of the weight of that crowd is really, you can really feel it in the videos as opposed to the photographs. Observing these massive gatherings and protests in Santiago, Nicaraguans immediately identified elements of their own struggle. In this instance, social media users drew a formal parallel. the upward movements of the crowd occupying a public monument, and the conceptual one, highlighting the strength of popular resistance. Throughout the 2019 and 2020 estallido social, as the Chilean protests are referred to locally, I noticed the return of images from the past, photographs from the 1973 Pinochet coup collated with images from 2019 showing the mistreatment of citizens by armed police. Whether having lived through that dark period in the history of the country or having absorbed its impact intergenerationally, citizens identified the same gestures, the same strategies of repression as they materialize in similar, if not the exact same locations as before. Similar montaged images and memes juxtaposing scenes from then and now went viral on Nicaraguan social media feeds soon after the start of the civic rebellion. Strikingly, I'm just showing you this very briefly, kind of parallels that were made between photographs from the historic Sandinista insurrection and photographs from the protests in 2018. Strikingly, direct associations were made between the FSLN and the Somoza regime, police forces and the National Guard, equating Ortega with Somoza. Further massive anti-governmental protests have been staged in Cuba in 2021. So this was July 11 to 17. And this was, although short, it was the largest kind of protest movement in Cuba in several decades. And I open a brief parenthesis. If you look at the image on the left, the banner that they're holding, it says, "Abajo la dictadura," down with the dictatorship, "Patria y vida." So this slogan, which has been translated as "Homeland and Life," is a retort to the famous revolutionary refrain, "Patria o muerte," "Homeland of death," kind of inaugurated by Fidel Castro after the revolutionary victory. And so Patria y Vida became popular after the release of a reggaeton song by the same name in February 2021 by a famous rapper called Yotuel and several other. It's a collaboration between different musicians. And the song criticized the government in very direct terms. And I'll just quote one line: "Mi pueblo pide libertad, no más doctrinas. Ya no gritemos patria o muerte, sino patria y vida." So that means my people ask for freedom, no more doctrines. We're no longer screaming homeland, free homeland or death. Instead, we're screaming homeland and life. So if you remember my earlier slide about the Nicaraguan revolutionary slogan, "Patria libre y vivir," instead of "Patria libre o morir," there's a kind of direct parallel. However, I want to point that these responses were entirely separate, which is quite interesting. So again, within this period of unrest, so further to what happened in Nicaragua and what was happening in Chile and everywhere else, there were further protests again in Cuba in 2021, and then in Peru between between 22 and 23, from December to March, so quite long, over a long period. And in Venezuela, again, last year's being the most recent, following the announcement of Maduro's win of a third term. And these protests lasted actually from July to September. And this was very much on my mind when I was first asked to prepare this talk. What I find really interesting is that when the protests began in Managua in 2018, I recall hearing frequent mention of what was happening in Venezuela. The similarities were not just on the surface, and the close relationship between Ortega and Maduro made protesters from both countries feel a strong sense of solidarity. Furthermore, the repressive measures that were being seen were perceived as similar enough to show that the regimes were in fact strongly interconnected. So one's fall could perhaps precipitate the fall of the other. I would say that those sentiments remain valid today, especially given the overlap between the two regimes' methodical suppression of dissent and their obstinacy in maintaining power at all costs. And I'll point here to a recent report by Human Rights Watch regarding the deadly protests of 2024 in Venezuela, which showed that on the one hand, the use of photography, video, and other data provides the use of photography in providing evidence of human rights violations. So you can see here a declaration on kind of what were the materials which were again brought in from citizens, from everyday citizens that were used to kind of establish the types of human rights violations that were committed during these protests. But also, you can also see, on the other hand, the types of repressive measures that were being implemented to counter dissent. So prosecutors in Venezuela have charged hundreds with sometimes broadly defined crimes carrying harsh sentences, including incitement to hatred, resistance to authority, and terrorism. This rings very much true in Nicaragua, where kind of false claims are kind of being invented all the time. You could be prosecuted, you could be in prison for pretty much any reason. Also, canceling passports of critics to prevent them from leaving the country, encouraging citizens to report on demonstrators, conducting abusive raids. Likewise, very resonant with the situation in Nicaragua, where also citizens are being stripped of their citizenship and expulsed from the country or not allowed to return. And then thirdly, this statement on the broad powers of the government to control and shut down non-governmental organizations. And this has been a measure that the Nicaraguan government has been implementing over several years and has basically kind of canceled out the majority of NGOs active in the country. Okay, so of course, yes, okay. So all of these protests have had mixed achievements and goals. And I'm not in any way trying to kind of collapse all of them. It's interesting to see, for example, how austerity measures in Ecuador were reversed as a consequence of the protests. The referendum for constitutional reform received a no vote in Uruguay. In Cuba, the government lifted restrictions on food and medicine, which had been an initial trigger for the protests. But of course, this is an important yet inadequate gain. The greater claims of the protesters remain unanswered while repression continues. In Chile, a constitutional referendum was held in 2020 in direct response to the protests, and 78.28% of Chileans vote in favor of a new constitution to be drafted, replacing the one written during the Pinochet regime. If you recall, one of the biggest kind of issues with the protests was this continuity between the Pinochet regime into the so-called, post-return, even after the return to democracy. So the tendency of authoritarianism to kind of seep through. And also, of course, likewise significant, Gabriel Boric, who is a former student activist and was a progressive candidate, won the presidential election in December 2021. Now, what interests me very much is how the fact that such large-scale protests, and all of the protests that I've talked about today are large-scale. Of course, there's countless other protests of different scales that are happening concurrently. But these large protests have generated a vast amount of photographic imagery, video documentation, visual graphics, and street art, connecting to local photographic history, tapping into regional and global imaginaries of resistance. It's interesting to consider that throughout the Cold War, photography served a direct testimonial purpose in various contexts in Latin America, documenting state terror. Sorry, I lost my line. Documenting state terror while sustaining the struggle for justice during most desperate times. As in the past, photography remained a faithful witness in 2019 and onwards, a participant, a tool for direct action in confronting an authoritarian regime. Furthermore, it continued to operate as a powerful visual means of activating and articulating memory into the present. This was definitely the case in Nicaragua, definitely the case in Chile. Yet now, this drive, the mobilizing potential that such potent images harnessed, was amplified within a network community, enveloping the multitude in a flurry of hashtags. In Nicaragua and Chile, this abundance dominated the visual field for months, operating in tandem with the motions and movements from the streets. Photography reigned over an enormous amount of new content that was generated primarily in Managua and Santiago, and photography was the means by which much of what happened, the marks that were left, the things that were made, the very texture of the protest was preserved. Of course, all of that was very much ephemeral. Celeste Mujica's project, Inventario Iconoclasta de la Insurrección Chilena. And I'm just showing you here because I wanted to include those slides in full. This is the name of the title in English, Iconoclast Inventory of the Chilean Insurrections since 2019, represents a notable attempt to sort through, assemble, and reassemble to establish connections amongst the fragments. Like an avid collector, the artist has amassed an archive out of multiple dispersed yet entangled sources and has emerged out of this process to propose a set of jarring juxtapositions and permutations, a taxonomy of sorts. So they're both her images and images that she's collected from everywhere online, all anonymized. Nothing seems settled. It could all shift again, recombine at any time. She invites us to reflect upon the, quote, property and circulation of images as a common and collective good, end quote. The logic behind the process is simple: to accumulate, to save as much as possible before it vanishes, or before it dissolves into an indistinguishable mass. The inventory has no authorship, she writes, and can be used by everyone, end quote. It, and again, quote, defends the right to archive. I think I have it here. Yes. It defends the right to archive, that is, to safeguard our memory, end quote. It must therefore incorporate some type of movement within so as to accommodate memory works. It shifts, it continues to change, like the crowd, alongside the constituents. Now, there are many models for interpreting the archive in general, but specifically this type of archive, which, when stripped of authority, is itself an accumulation, inclusive of occlusions and erasures, and hence retains a certain potential. And I'm nodding here to Ariela Azule for a retelling, a repositioning of history. In his oft-referenced text, Archive Fever, Photography Between History and the Monument, Okoye-Nvezor argued that the archive, as an active regulatory discursive system, quote, end quote, has become central to contemporary artists. And he writes, and I open a quote, because the camera is literally an archiving machine, every photograph, every film is a priori an archival object, an excess of the scene. So this archival reflex, which I would qualify as an instinct rather than an impulse, a fever, as Derrida had characterized it, is certainly seen in heightened political circumstances, such as those described here today. Although I should add that while Derrida's original formulation as le mal d'archive implies discomfort, sickness, I am diverting the phrase here to signal a type of engagement with images in their myriad forms that is urgent, necessary, and which implies a taking of position. This is about all-encompassing procedures meant to safeguard, hoard even, unselectively, without judgment of value, with errors and glitches included, the fragments of a rapidly shifting surround. Now, moving beyond Latin America, I'm really struck by certain parallels with visual practices that have emerged around the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. So, an immediate manifestation of archive fever could be seen in the effort to comprehensively document the so-called Lenin Wall, which was constructed out of thousands of post-it notes during the 2014 umbrella movement. As a whole, the Hong Kong movement impresses through the vast multitude of images that has accompanied the protests from day one and which have been collected by participants. Here too, pressure to remove and erase traces of dissidents due to the increased repression and criminalization of protest actions resonate deeply. One body of work in particular captured my attention, Su Wai Hang's Clean Hong Kong Action from 2019, subtitled, as an explanation perhaps, Photography with Holes. I scroll through image after image of gathering and dispersing crowds, everyone's face covered by a blank dot. The shape becomes a physical point of coincidence, a punctum, if you'd like, reminding the viewer that this document also documents an intervention from the outside. In order to preserve anonymity, to safeguard people's identities into an unpredictable future, the photographer must cancel out their work in a similar way to how a censor might act. And they write, I decided to protect the people by punching holes on their faces in my photographs, an act also to reinstate the importance of photography in this event, reconciling my role as a protester and photographer, end quote. Yet somehow, against the odds, it is precisely the repetition of this gesture, the accumulation of dots, the opposite of this trickster stunt pulled by Baldessari and his colorful dots, that drives the point across, as the multitude asserts its ubiquitous, haunting presence. Under permanent surveillance, the expression under the cover of the crowd no longer applies. Photographers, archivists, image collectors, researchers, we are all hyper-aware that any quote-unquote innocent image of a crowd of protesters, even more so those that once served as a rallying call, can easily be upturned and used as part of a cruel, punishing apparatus of control. Everybody, any one body on the line. Suddenly, Elias Canetti writes, it is as though everything were happening in one and the same body. End quote. Might the extreme of being together be constituted by a massive, seemingly endless crowd? Somehow the term feels uneasy. I prefer the term multitude, as it feels wider, more accommodating. Hart and Negri theorize the multitude as a network, as they write, multiplicity of singular differences, end quote. By contrast to the mass, mob, or crowd, the multitude, they explain, quote, is composed of a set of singularities, and by singularity here we mean a social subject whose difference cannot be reduced to sameness, a difference that remains different, end quote. My mind drifts to the occupation of Tahrir Square during the 2011 Egyptian revolution. I remember watching the steady flow of images, moving and still, transmitted 24/7 on news sites and through social media. Mobile phones and cameras streaming from within the pulsating square, complemented by those providing overview images from the surrounding buildings. The multitude moving slowly like waves within a sea of images, similarly again to the Chilean and Nicaraguan protests. Or I'm thinking of the Sri Lankan protests of July 2022, when protesters breached the gates of the presidential palace in Colombo, and spectacular videos, again, the images, the photographs don't capture it as well, spectacular videos that showed the improbably coordinated movements of the multitude, their ebb and flow. Outlining the four attributes of the crowd in his book Crowds and Power, Canetti wrote, quote, within the crowd there is equality, and one might even define a crowd as a state of absolute equality. A head is a head, an arm is an arm, and differences between individual heads and arms are irrelevant, end quote. I think of Tina Modotti's famous picture of Mexican workers at a May Day parade, a vertical cut showing a large group of men, how large, marching ahead towards the top. Almost immediately, Brazilian artist Ligia Pape's installation Divisor from 1968 comes to mind. The piece required the participation of people, all of whom had to stick their heads through an immense composite piece of fabric, the white surface acting as a connector, the formal opposite of Hang's punched holes in the picture from Hong Kong. The gesture reminds me of the interconnected hands of those who formed together with families, friends, and neighbors the Baltic chain across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania on the 23rd of August, 1989. An extended multitude. So, by contrast to the mass, mob, or crowd, the multitude, Hart and Negri write, and I quote again, is composed of a set of singularities, and by singularity we mean a social subject whose difference cannot be reduced to sameness, a difference that remains different, end quote. I want to stop for a moment to consider this singularity. In photographic terms, the crowd hinders individuation. It can become a cover, especially as we have seen in cases where participation in civic protests can lead to persecution. We might ask whose faces, whose features, whose personhood rises out from the crowd. In almost all of the instances that I touched upon here today, the emphasis has been consistently on the people as a whole, el pueblo in Spanish, with its fractions and divisions, rejecting protagonism and the figure of the leader. This is really, really interesting. To quote an oft-repeated refrain, solo el pueblo salva al pueblo. Only the people can save the people. This iteration connects yet again to historic struggles for justice across Latin America, having originated in response to authoritarian regimes during the Cold War. Throughout that period, photography had been used as a tool for confronting oppressive regimes and demanding justice, and has remained intrinsic to memorialization practices working towards non-repetition. So from the struggle of the madres and abuelas in Argentina since 1977 to those of the comadres during the armed conflict in El Salvador in the 80s, photographs of victims of state terror carried by families in the midst of their communities as part of protests and commemorative acts have become almost synonymous with resistance movements in Latin America. By wearing the small IDs around their necks, I open a quote, by wearing the small IDs around their necks, the madres turned their bodies into archives, preserving and displaying the images that had been targeted for erasure, writes Diana Taylor. She continues, instead of the body in the archive associated with surveillance, I have the quote here. Instead of the body in the archive associated with surveillance and police strategies, they staged the archive in on the body, affirming that embodied performance could make visible that which had been purged from the archive. Again, an archive that is mobilized towards justice-seeking ends. In Mexico, another powerful example, members of the public have rallied time and again around the incriminatory slogan, Fue el Estado, it was the state, demanding accountability for cases as extreme as that of Ayotzinapa. Nos faltan 43, or just the number 43, we're missing 43, haunts public discourse. The students' names, always accompanied by the response, presente, resonate amongst marches, scribbled onto streets and squares as people continue to gather, carrying the portraits of the missing student teachers. These chants, slogans, and visual strategies resonated immediately in Nicaragua in 2018 and thereafter. People marched carrying portraits of the victims, calling their names, the crowd chanting presente in turn. Words and images wove themselves into the texture of everyday life. There was also a deliberate attempt to move away from the heroic FSLN discourse around martyrdom, where the notion of sacrificing oneself for a cause no longer applied. There was no cause other than freedom, justice. So there was a condemnation of violence and a rejection of the kind of discourse, historic discourse about martyrdom. The appearance of portraits of the victims of the repression in public space and online was a key characteristic of the 2018 protests in Nicaragua. Often taken from social media profiles, these portraits would either turn into stencils or enlarged, carried in procession, displayed as memorial images. Here, you can see both strategies coinciding in the visual field. So you see in the background interventions onto this wall, and these posters read Justicia, justice, and they had been installed there previously or perhaps as part of another march. And then here in front, we see the crowd carrying these enlarged portraits of the victims of the repression. And what's also very interesting is that the memorial images, which I showed earlier in so I showed these augmentation images earlier in the talk, but what's interesting is that this intervention at the back is actually pasted right on top of portraits, murals of General Augusto Sandino and Carlos Fonseca, who are considered the founding figures of of Sandinismo. Augusto Sandino had led the anti-imperialist movement against the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua between 1912 and 1933, and Fonseca was actually the founder of the Sandinista National Liberation Fund. So they're being kind of blocked out. The portraits, So such interventions in public space served to ultimately keep these victims in the public eye, demanding that the government be made accountable. A powerful, heartbreaking example was the case of 15-year-old secondary school student Álvaro Conrado Dávila, endearingly referred to as Alvarito, one of the earliest victims of the repression. He was shot and mortally wounded by the Nicaraguan police while bringing water to protesters during a march in Managua on April 20th, 2018. Alvarito's portrait, seen here on the left, and his last words, read here, "Me duele respirar, it hurts to breathe," became instantly viral, carried by protesters, stenciled onto walls in Managua and in other cities and towns, even in small communities, as documented in these examples from the Instagram account I mentioned earlier, Paredes Nicas. The persistence of these images was astounding, given the effort of public bodies to erase them. They would just come up time and again. Coda, instead of a conclusion. I shared here today, and this is where my presentation becomes a bit more unraveled, I guess. I shared here today what I hope are persuasive arguments about the power of photography to bring us together, and in turn, about the limitless horizons our shared potential power might propel us towards. I recognize that this is idealistic, yet I find that it is the only honorable, dignified, and conceivable response to events that have shaped our recent history and unsettled present. Of course, massive protests do not necessarily imply a progressive agenda. The multitude can also behave erratically, chaotically, it can become unruly, a mob. I'm thinking of recent events such as the storming of the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, and the relatively less violent yet equally unsettling attacks on the National Congress and other governmental buildings in Brasilia by Bolsonaro supporters almost exactly 1 year later, 8th of January 2023, following Lula's inauguration. The crowd can be controlled and or externally manipulated. For example, in organized marches. In most of the contexts described today, governments sought to organize in response to massive protests, they organized massive counter-marches to show the extent to which they still had popular support. The most recent and highly disturbing iteration thereof was seen on a live broadcast of a ceremony to swear in 30,000 paramilitary troops as part of a so-called Policía Voluntaria, the voluntary police peacekeeping force, which is now inscribed in the Constitution, in Managua on February 26th, coincidentally the same day as the latest UN report describing the extent of human rights violations in Nicaragua came out. It is likely, according to some sources, that the numbers of paramilitaries seen here are greatly inflated through the incorporation of state employees. Whether these people have any kind of military training or whether they will participate in any kind of repressive campaigns is difficult to tell. But what strikes me is that this entire choreography very much resembles Chinese or Soviet pre-89 military parades, perhaps a more impoverished version, although obviously the Cuban Revolution and Nicaragua itself serve as a more immediate reference. Yet the symbolism and cult of the crowd in fascism and Stalinism certainly sends a shiver down one's spine. And I was remembering immediately, I was thinking of Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. I'll just show you two more images. The ceremony lasted hours, and here you can see Ortega and Murillo in front of the newly sworn-in paramilitaries with the chief of police. Okay. I want to leave on perhaps a more consoling image, and this time from a very, very different location and a different time. Bucharest, December 21st, 1989. The scene is set for a nationwide transmission of what was to become Nicolae Ceausescu's last speech. A crowd has gathered and is being carefully directed from the sides. Clap now. Cheer. Silence. The only singular faces to be seen are those of the leaders, Nicolae and Elena, idealistically portrayed as eternally young. Harun Faraki and Andrei Ujika's film Videographs of a Revolution deconstructs that situation brilliantly, analyzing the movements of and exchanges between the protagonists, camera, and crowd. I very much suggest watching the film if you haven't. All seems to be going according to plan, as usual, but Ceausescu is interrupted due to unexpected movements within the audience. You can almost hear the crowd shuffle, just slightly. Tightly controlled just a few seconds previous, the crowd turns from obedient to disobedient with a boo. The camera pans towards the sky, trying to reconcile the interruption, and soon thereafter transmission cuts. That was the beginning of the Romanian Revolution transmitted live. So I end with this image here showing again the crowd with a banner that reads, "Down with the tyrant." And yeah, that's about it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ileana. That was fascinating. May I offer you a round of applause on behalf of all of our audience for that powerful and insightful lecture. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, very happy to answer questions if anyone